Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the dramatic lifespan of literally one of the most massive, ambitious, and, spoiler alert, ultimately flawed economic experiments in human history, the state-run economy of the Soviet Union. We're going to trace the whole shebang. The incredible initial ascent, the era of stagnation, the hidden shadow economy that kept it limping along, and then, of course, its spectacular collapse. There's a ton of fascinating data to cover, so let's jump right in.
Okay, so get this. During the era when the Soviet economy was entirely publicly owned and planned, its per capita growth expanded by an astonishing factor of 5.2. To put that massive number into perspective, it actually outpaced Western Europe, which grew by a factor of 4.0. It even completely exceeded the growth rates of the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. No way, right? But for decades, this economic engine was an absolute powerhouse, literally trailing only a handful of nations globally when it came to the sheer speed of industrialization. But this brings us to a huge historical mystery. How exactly does a system capable of such explosive, world-beating growth end up completely bankrupt by 1991? It's your classic Icarus arc, flying incredibly high only to crash right back down to Earth. Well, to understand the fall, we first have to understand the mechanics of how this massive engine actually worked.
Section 1, the Command Economy Engine. Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp the Soviet system, you kind of have to throw out absolutely everything you know about supply, demand, and the free market. The beating heart of the entire system was Gosplan, the State Planning Committee. Instead of markets dictating what gets produced, Gosplan dictated absolutely everything through government command. We're talking about millions upon millions of complex economic calculations done manually, year after year, completely without the aid of modern computers. They set the exact quotas for steel production, decided the precise number of tractors to be built, and rigidly fixed the prices of every single consumer good. Price wasn't a reflection of consumer demand anymore. It was just a fixed state decree. Because of this rigid central planning, a loaf of bread cost exactly 10 kopecks, whether you were shopping in a bustling Moscow supermarket or a remote Siberian village. So, to fuel this massive command economy, the state orchestrated a really forceful shift in human capital. And it's truly staggering just how rapidly the workforce transformed. Back in 1940, over half the population, about 54%, was working in agriculture. But by 1984, that number had plummeted to just 20%. Millions of people were literally moved from rural farms into newly built urban factories and sprawling industrial centers. This brutal, but honestly highly effective centralization of labor is exactly what allowed for their rapid, heavy industrialization. It was basically a complete societal reengineering in the span of a single generation.
Section 2, Rapid Growth and Modernization.
And that forceful industrialization actually yielded undeniable early results and immense global credibility. This wasn't just, numbers on a page. It translated into massive social and economic successes mid-century. When we compare the USSR's GDP per head with other regions, the trajectory against Latin America is super striking. Places in the Soviet Union that started out as incredibly poor, pre-modern regions in the 1920s entirely surpassed comparable nations in the global south by the 1980s. The command economy proved remarkably effective at brute forcing an agrarian society straight into a modern industrial one.
And all this newfound industrial wealth? Well, it was funneled into some pretty revolutionary social safety nets for the time. The Soviet Union implemented the Semashko model, which provided state-funded healthcare free of charge to all citizens. This was a radical concept back then, establishing this huge network of clinics that successfully eradicated mass diseases like typhus and cholera, which had plagued the region for centuries. Plus, they heavily funded universal education. They managed the monumental task of transforming a largely illiterate peasant population into one of the most highly educated and scientifically literate workforces in the world. Oh, and officially at least, unemployment was virtually eliminated, hovering around just 1 to 2%. So for a time, it really seemed like the system was delivering on its utopian promises.
Section 3, the Era of Stagnation.
But here's the thing. Brute forcing industrialization really only works for so long. Eventually, an economy needs to innovate and efficiently meet the complex, constantly changing demands of its consumers. And by the 1970s and 80s, what we often call the Brezhnev era, we see the system's fatal flaw really start to take hold. The Soviet Union was locked in a bitter Cold War. And to maintain that superpower status, they poured a staggering 15 to 17% of their entire GNP into defense and the military. This massive spending was largely sustained by high global oil prices.
But this military superiority came at a severe, compounding cost to domestic development. Household consumption, the everyday goods people actually wanted and needed, steadily declined as a share of the economy, dropping down to 55%. The state's factories were highly efficient at churning out thousands of tanks and ballistic missiles, absolutely. But they were utterly failing at producing basic refrigerators, quality clothes, or even decent food for the population.
Now, the human toll of this economic stagnation was incredibly profound. The leadership was aging, a deeply out-of-touch gerontocracy desperately clinging to power. Everyday citizens faced constant shortages, spending hours in endless, grueling queues just to secure basic, low-quality goods. And this grinding daily reality led to widespread public frustration, cynicism, and just a pervasive apathy toward the state's grand ideological claims. A pretty stark indicator of this severe social pathology is alcohol consumption. Soviet citizens were consuming roughly 16 liters of pure alcohol per person annually. To give you a comparison drawn directly from the economic data of the time, that was more than triple the consumption in a country like Norway, where it was around 5 liters. The state system simply wasn't delivering a high quality of life, and society was basically checking out, seeking escape wherever it could.
Section 4. The Shadow Economy. So, you might be wondering, if the official economy wasn't providing what people needed to survive and be happy, how exactly did they get by? Well, you essentially had two completely different economies running in parallel. The official economy was increasingly just an illusion. You had state bureaucrats reporting miraculously fulfilled targets and fixing prices, while the actual store shelves sat completely empty. But then there was the second economy. That was the reality on the ground. This operated on a cultural system called Blatt, which was a complex, informal, and deeply ingrained network of favors, connections, and under-the-table exchanges. You used Blatt to procure absolutely everything, from decent medical care and rare medicines to something as simple as a pair of imported jeans. It was a thriving underground market driven by private gain, operating in direct contravention of Soviet law, but, it was absolutely essential for daily survival in the USSR. And the sheer scale of the shadow economy was truly staggering. It was gradually hollowing out the logic of the entire central command system from the inside. For a really striking example, just look at funeral services in the late 1970s. The entire population spent about 96 million rubles on official, state-sanctioned funeral services. But get this, they spent an estimated 342 to 517 million rubles paying private individuals for unofficial, under-the-table funeral arrangements. The black market was often 5 times larger than the official state apparatus in certain sectors. The government was quite literally losing its grip on the actual economic activity of its citizens.
Section 5. Reform and Ultimate Collapse.
By the mid-1980s, the glaring disparity between the illusion of state planning and the reality of economic decay was just impossible to ignore. Which brings us to the final chapter, desperate attempts to fix a deeply broken machine. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985, he recognized the crisis and introduced perestroika, a grand restructuring. He tried to relax rigid state control over enterprises, finally giving factories more autonomy. But actually, here was the fatal error in execution. He decentralized decision-making without introducing actual free market pricing or private property rights. So factory managers could suddenly decide what to produce, but without market prices signaling demand, it just led to massive resource misallocation. Add to this structural chaos the catastrophic financial and human cost of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, and simultaneously plummeting global oil prices, which totally cut off the state's main source of hard currency. Without brutal state enforcement, but also entirely lacking market incentives, total output fell sharply. And to cover its massive, growing deficits, the government simply kept printing money, leading to a devastating wave of suppressed inflation, where money became essentially worthless. By the end of 1991, the system simply snapped. The Soviet Union officially dissolved. And what did this once mighty economic engine leave to its primary successor, the Russian Federation? Well, an absolute mountain of external debt totaling $66 billion. They were left with practically empty net gold and foreign exchange reserves, and they inherited an economy in total freefall, with surging, desperate poverty across the general population. The massive engine had entirely, completely run out of fuel.
The transition away from the system was a profound tragedy in itself. The sudden, wholesale privatization in the 1990s led to immense wealth disparities, creating an ultra-wealthy oligarchical class almost overnight, while everyday citizens suffered through total economic collapse.
As the economic data highlights, these shocks were associated with sharp, devastating increases in mortality rates across the region and a massive 9 percentage point increase in the Gini ratio for inequality. It leaves us with a pretty provocative, haunting thought. If the immense human cost of forcing an entire economy into absolute state control was unimaginably high, the human cost of tearing that massive structure down overnight proved to be equally devastating. So what exactly is the right balance between state planning and market freedom? Well, it's a huge question economists are still debating today.